Welcome everybody from Westside. Anyone else joining us? This is our third part of our study of the history of the making of the English Bible through the King James Version. So it's the greatest version that has ever been translated. It has held sway in the English-speaking world for 4 centuries. It celebrated, of course, its 400th anniversary back in 2011. Now it's beginning to go the way of all the earth. There still are peoples within every congregation and among churches of Christ that use the old King James as their main study Bible, or the New King James. If you were to add those two together, I would suppose that it might be the majority of people in the congregation. If you combine both the old King James and the New King James, that would still hold sway for the most part. And that's how magisterial the work of the old King James translators has been compared to any other version. You consider any of the others that have been translated, even the Old American Standard, which has just virtually disappeared, was in England in 1881, I believe, somewhere along that line. Of course, 1901, the American Standard version of it. And it has just all but disappeared. You can't even hardly find a copy of it. The New American Standard, of course, came as a result of that work, and it was an improvement over the American Standard, or was assumed an improvement over the American Standard. There are people that argue that it was not the case, but nonetheless, that did not come into existence until about the mid part of the 20th century. So most of the versions that you can think about that people use today, they are translations that have occurred no later than the mid 20th century, and for the most part, would be using versions that were not until after the 1970s. So when you consider that, I use the English Standard Version, so it's one of the very new modern versions that have been translated. And sometime I'll do a whole series on that type of thing, what we should look for in translations, and think about all that. But right now, we just wanted to look through the history of the Bibles that came before the King James. The King James so significant that we're dividing this into two parts. So let me just summarize what we began to study last week, or the last session, I'm sorry. There was a Hampton Court conference called by the new king. Queen Elizabeth I has died, and she had no offspring. She never married, and so she said, who can be our successor but our cousin in Scotland? So he was King James the Sixth of Scotland, became King James the First of the United Kingdom. And so when he takes throne, on his way down, in fact, he had been, uh, uh, people had approached him among the Puritans. All right, so these would be the people that are trying to separate from the English, the Church of England, which was very Roman Catholic in its organization. Yes, it was Protestant, or would become Protestant in its viewpoints of Scripture, in the main doctrines, but rejecting the Pope, rejecting the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. But it just established its own hierarchy, with the Archbishop of Canterbury being virtually the same in power as the Pope, and all the bishops and everybody that came underneath it. So they were, of course, paraded around the king in this picture of the Puritans offering the millenary petition that there be a new translation that would be usable by all peoples. And at this time, King James himself was using the Geneva Bible. That was his personal reading copy, even though the bishop's Bible was the official Bible that had been translated under Queen Elizabeth. And it never gained acceptance among the English people at large, the English-speaking peoples. In fact, only 8% of its language is estimated to have found its way into the Old King James. And so that millenary petition actually resonated with King James I, and he ordered that 54 scholars undertake a new Bible translation. Now, he, of course, gave that over to the Archbishop of Canterbury at that time, was Richard Bancroft. Now, this is the first time that a team of translators have ever attempted this task. Many times the Bibles you see below, of course, obviously the bishop's Bible had been by different bishops, but not in the concerted way of each committee's going to examine the work of the other committee. All right, Tyndall's, Coverdale's, Matthews, those are all just by one man translations. So we can't even conceive that today. I believe when the New King James had its revision done and came to pass in the early 1980s, late 1970s, there was over 100 scholars that participated in that. The English Standard's the same way. In fact, there were English scholars that accompanied the Greek and Hebrew scholars to do that translation. So we can't even imagine. There have been modern one-man translations, but nobody seriously uses those as their main study Bible. And the reason for that, of course, would be that these men could correctly look at the original Greek and Hebrew. How is it best translated? If they disagreed, you'll find it in the footnotes a lot of times of the more modern versions that there was a significant number of the translators who believed it ought to be translated this way. So they'll let you know that. Or they'll italicize words that are not found in the original. They're put into the English vernacular because it doesn't make sense to us without it being supplied with hopefully as few words as possible that are inserted by the translators. But all of this is a process that is just really taking its root in those men that translated the King James. So for 6 years, these 6 teams would work on using the Textus Receptus. Remember that Erastus had taken all the Greek manuscripts, there were thousands of copies, and he had made a standardized Greek text that's called the received text, or in the Latin Textus Receptus. And then these other Bibles were also consulted, particularly they were ordered to consult the Bishop's Bible. Gordon Campbell, in his book, The Story of the King James Version, said it would be difficult now to bring together a group of more than 50 scholars with the range of languages and knowledge of other disciplines that characterize the King James translators. We may live in a world with more knowledge, but it is populated by people with less knowledge. And we looked at some of the men individually last time that had learned to speak Greek when they were 6 years old, or Hebrew, and then learned to be proficient in Greek when they were 13 years old, both classical and Koine. The range of languages, one man said, could have been the interpreter general at the Tower of Babel. Just they were a living library unto themselves. Some of the words that describe these men, again, men of extraordinary ability at a very seminal point in history that brought together the official king wanting this to happen, and so it did happen. So let's pick up then with the printing of the Bible. Okay, so Robert Barker is the royal printer. His father had been the royal printer under Elizabeth the first, and he had died, of course, had turned the business over to Robert Barker. Now, there were other printers, and actually they would help somewhat in this, but a lot of jealousy. Can you imagine what they were thinking about, the kind of money that they would make? But here's a fascinating thing. King James never authorized any money to print the Bible that he was so adamant should come to pass, and had been this extraordinary work from 1604 to 1611. And yet no monies by Parliament, King James, were ever given to print the Bible. So Barker himself underwrote the huge cost of printing the first King James. And it cost 3,500 pounds sterling, the English monetary unit, in 1611. So I did a little research on that. You can go out and do your own. But you have to go and have people that will compare ancient money to modern times. A lot of calculations they have to go into. The one that I went to, the internet, you can just do your own search, came up with, and then I converted it into what would that number in pounds sterling. It was 17 million to have the same status, okay, different ways of measuring it. But say somebody had 3,500 pounds to their name in 1611, what kind of wealth would they have in 2019? It always is a year behind the year we're in. And when you do these calculations, and it would be like 17.5 million pounds. Okay, so what does that convert into 2020? That's 22,826,000. Okay, if the sites I'm using. But anyway, you can imagine just a unbelievable sum of money. And so there probably are political things. I didn't take the time to look into all of that are going on, that King James, the Parliament, never authorized any money. But he saw it, of course, as something he probably could have made a lot of profit from, and he never made the profit from it for his own bad business. He wasn't a businessman, and his own bad practices led him to die in debtor's prison. Back in that time, when you owed a debt, it wasn't bankruptcy, a debt you couldn't repay, they put you into prison, and your family, others would have to pay that debt back to get you released. And he was never released. He dies there in 1643, having been put there in 1635. Now, one of the things that was just so much led to his demise is that in 1631 he was fined 300 pounds sterling, which is 50,000 pounds in 2019, for leaving the word not out of the seventh of the Ten Commandments. And it became known as the Wicked Bible, or the Adulterous Bible, or the Sinner's Bible, because the seventh of the Ten Commandments, and there is a photocopy there at the very bottom right-hand corner of the screen, thou shalt commit adultery. That's exactly what it looks like in the printed copies. And so while we find it maybe a bit humorous today, it would have been a great mistake, and of course it would have made the evening news, and you can imagine what would happen. In that day and age, such serious business, Charles I, who's the son of King James I, is on the throne in 1631, and a different Archbishop of Canterbury, I forgot his name now, they were, of course, appalled by this. So they haul Barker in before the official court, and he is fined 50,000 pounds sterling. So you can only imagine he didn't have the money to do that, and never made any money from the King James. All the Bibles were ordered to be destroyed, but 14 of them are known to exist. 13 of them are in museums and libraries. Where I checked, some of them have come up for sale. The latest one I think I saw sold for $56,000, a copy of this. Again, sometimes libraries and others buy them, but there's only one in private hands at this juncture. There was a guy in the 1850s, I believe, it was the one that came up with the name The Wicked Bible, and it's stuck ever since, as you can see on the face of a copy that was made long, long ago. So I thought you would find that very fascinating about what happened with the printing of the text. The King James Version is called the Authorized Version. I have a friend that he's always kidding. He uses the old King James, and he'll always kid me. He says, I use the Authorized Version. But while it carries that name, King James never gave the finished version his royal approval. There never was any known act of Parliament or a convocation or the Privy Council. Remember, the Privy Council are the men of great power that surround the king and are his advisors, and many times, if the truth be known, as powerful as the king. Never issued a decree to officially authorize this, as the Bishop's Bible had been authorized by Elizabeth I to be used in all the churches of the time. It's just fascinating to think how the King James Bible came to exist when no monies were given to put it into print. A man makes terrible mistakes. In fact, the print quality is horrible. I don't know if you noticed in that last, I'll go back to that one, but notice how crooked the print is. I mean, it's not even straight across the page. And better quality was done in that time than this. So he just was a poor businessman. But again, it's amazing it ever came to pass with there being no official support of it after apparently it came into existence. But the final product, is Bruce Metzger, a scholar of the original languages in the 20th century, said the final product was certainly the best English Bible that had thus far been produced. Its English style is widely recognized as superb. This is best described in Miles Smith's statement of purpose in the preface of the book: to deliver God's book unto God's people in a tongue which they could understand. Now, part of the reason maybe that I forgot to mention this, that the English Bible had such trouble, is that just not long after 1631, when all that mistakes were made, the English Civil War came about in 1640. Remember, Charles II will be beheaded by Cromwell, and there'll be no king, and Cromwell will rule basically as Lord Protector of England, and the separatists will win the battles that are fought, ultimately the war against the throne. Eventually, people will bring back. I may have said Charles II. I believe it was Charles I that was beheaded, and then Charles II will be brought back to the throne. The people will have had enough of that dictatorial rule by Cromwell. But all of that happens sort of at this same time period. I mean, after 1611, but could explain why money's never were forthcoming. But again, what he says about the English Bible, the King James, being so magisterial in its style, superb, 9/10 of the words are Anglo-Saxon. So England was coming into its heyday of power, and would, of course, dominate the world for the several centuries after this. The King James vocabulary is very minimal. Only 8,000 words make it up. And yet, the Anglo-Saxon captures the Hebrew superlatives like Holy of Holies, or the Song of Songs, or King of Kings. We can't even imagine not saying those phrases. In fact, modern versions still use those phrases that the original, the Anglo-Saxon English, brought into effect because of the way they translate. Vanity of vanity. All is vanity. All is the chasing a wind, as the Ecclesiastes author says, vanity of vanities. The inverting of the noun and the adjective. Man of war, rock of ages, man of sorrows, son of man. I mean, think of how powerful those phrases are, and they have never, I mean, we can't even imagine saying it the opposite of that. And yet the English would be maybe more accurate to do it the opposite. And those that have tried to improve on the King James and make it sort of like a precision instrument, you know, take a scalpel and, you know, cut it to a fine line, they just never capture the cadence and the beauty that are in the old King James tongue. And of course, the New King James tries to do that. All right, so the King James edition used today is last revised in AD 1769. However, it does not make use of any recently between 1611 and 1769. They had discovered a manuscript that pushed the manuscripts of the Textus Receptus. It went way back beyond it, so it would have been good to compare how did the English come, or rather the Greek, come down through the ages. And that's what will lead finally, ultimately, to the American Standard, and the New American Standard being based upon the Westcott Hort Greek text that will come into play because these other manuscripts were discovered with time. Well, at that time, by 1769, the Codex Alexandrinus, however you pronounce it, is the most popular Bible for more than 300 years, but it doesn't take into effect some of those more modern manuscripts that have been found. And yet, as H.L. Mencken says, many attempts have been made to purge the King James of its errors and obscurities, and many learned but misguided men have sought to produce translations that should be mathematically accurate, for it is palpably and overwhelmingly better than they are. Macaulay wrote in his essay on Dryden that if everything else in our language should perish, it alone, the King James Version, the old King James, would suffice to show the whole extent of the beauty and power of the English language. So let me show you some examples of that in a minute. Bruce Metzger, another quote from him, says, from the 1760s onward, critical evaluation became increasingly favorable, and the 1611 version quietly superseded all its predecessors. It owes its authority and popularity not to royal favor or legal enactment. That never happened, any legal enactment. But what is far better, to intrinsic merits and the verdict of English readers in general. They're the ones who put their stamp on this and why it had such powerful play into America, into North America, and into the language that shaped even our American usage of English. Okay, so here's what I wanted to show you. Just take that famous passage in Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 4. We'll come to the King James in a minute, but I want to show you. Remember, Coverdale was one of the individual translators back before the King James. The Geneva was when they all had to flee Bloody Mary the I, who was Roman Catholic, go to Switzerland, go to the continent, and there they translated what was the most popular Bible used by King James himself before. They didn't use the Bishop's Bible. Everybody was using the Geneva Bible. But here's how they translate that passage. Coverdale, they shall break their swords and spears to make scythes, sickles, and saws thereof. They shall break their swords also into mattocks, and their spears into scythes. Again, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Doesn't sound like ours, does it? Here's what the King James says. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Now, listen to the cadence. I mean, listen to how it flows. They just were amazing in their ability to capture the Anglo-Saxon English and use it to just empower, bring forth the Hebrew in this case. Again, to go on with that same passage, Coverdale, from that time forth shall not one people lift up weapon against another, neither shall they learn to fight from thenceforth. How stilted is that? Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn to fight any more. Well, a clean translation of it, but listen to the cadence. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Again, very similar to the Geneva translation, maybe identical now that I look at it, but a little bit different. There's one, I think, a word or so that's left out, but very much an improvement over Coverdale. Again, some of these other versions would play into their translation, but the cadence of it would always be something that the King James just had, and version. That's why it stuck. So revisions that occurred in the 19th and the 20th century. In 1847, the American Bible Society prepared a standardized text. If you can imagine that when they went searching, they had 6 or so copies that they had obtained from well-known printers of the time. And they found that there were 24,000 variations. Now, there is not one that mars the integrity of the text or affects any doctrine or precept of the Bible, Metzger points out. But they were spellings. They were order of the words in the text. They were still the old King James words, but modern syntax, would say it ought to change to be this way now. And so one printer would do one thing. I mean, they just did whatever they wanted to do, and so there was no standard. We can't even imagine that. If I pick up an old King James in the pew of any church building today, and say I were to compare it to my King James at home, it's going to be exactly the same word order. It's going to be the exact same words. They're going to be spelled the same way. So we can't imagine what it was like before, but that's what was the case. In 1861, various orthographic changes were made to the text. That Greek word, or rather English word, is a compound of 2 Greek words. Orthos, that means straight or correct. For instance, orthopedic surgery. What do? You straighten out broken bones, basically. You make them correct. So orthos. And then the word graphe, all right? So our word for autograph. A man gives us, or a woman, their signature. We seek the autograph of somebody famous. Their self-writing, okay, autograph. Or graffiti for graph. It means writings. So orthographic means correct writings. It's basically the spelling of words. Sometimes, as we saw in the Old English, there were 2 L's. All right, we dropped finally the 2 L, and then we just have 1 L. All right, the spelling of old, remember, was O-U-L-D, and then it became O-L-D. So various orthographic changes were made to the text. In 1932, more were made, but this time for American usage, okay, for the way we spell words. As we always say, the English don't know how to spell the word color. They spell it C-O-L-O-U-R, and we don't have the U. As other verbs, favor, for instance, same way in England versus American usage. In 1962, the text is arranged in paragraph form and punctuation is put in. Again, vast improvements. In fact, every modern Bible is going to have that paragraph form and so forth. And then in 1982, the Thomas Nelson Corporation in Nashville, Tennessee, modernized the language, taking the these and thous out and putting them into the modern way that we refer to he, she, and for instance, pronouns, you, and so forth, into thou and so forth. the modernized the language of the King James, and it's called the New King James. And I was in college when I believe the New Testament came out in 1979, so I was in the thick of college. And when you're in college, you're always fascinated by the new. And but the New King James is a good translation. All right, it's not changing the Old King James, but it also only uses the Textus Receptus. So that's that great argument about should we use the more modern Westcott and Hort that has found the manuscripts that had been found since the 1611 Textus Receptus, use of 1611, using the Textus Receptus at that time. Nonetheless, that's an argument for another time, another place. I used the New King James. It was my study Bible, preaching Bible until probably the last 8 years or so. I've used the English Standard Version, which is a more modern translation even than the New King James. All right, Miles Smith, who was the Bishop of Gloucester, he was also one of the translators, member of the final editing committee. So in the preface, he writes these words: "The Scriptures we are commanded to search. If we be ignorant, they will instruct us. If out of the way, they will bring us home. If out of order, they will reform us. If in heaviness, comfort us. If dull, quicken us. If cold, inflame us. But how shall men meditate in that which they cannot understand? How shall they understand that which is kept close in an unknown tongue?" Translation, he goes on to say, "It is that openeth the window to let in the light, that breaketh the shell, that we may eat the kernel, that removeth the cover of the well, that we may come by the water. Indeed, without translation into the vulgar tongue," so he means the common language, "the unlearned are but like children at Jacob's well without a bucket or something to draw with." So even the officials began to really understand that the Bible needs to be read and understood in the common vernacular of whatever nations, and in this case, of course, the power of the English language. Can you read this? This is Hebrew. This is a passage out of the Bible. And you and I would, most of us, it just looks like chicken scratch across the page. But here is the passage, Hosea 4:6. "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." How appropriate. We would be destroyed for lack of knowledge because we could not even understand unless somebody read it to us. Can you imagine having to depend on somebody else reading the text to you? You cannot study it for your own. You have to hope that they're reading it to you accurately. And because you have rejected knowledge, I will also reject you from being priest for me. Because you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children. And that previous Hebrew is the verse we just read. What a marvel was done for us in the translation of the original languages of Hebrew and Greek into the English tongue. All right, to just tell you how difficult times were, even with that translation, the Puritans, the Separatists, the Presbyterians of the time were seeking the truth. And they challenged the Church of England because although it had begun to embrace certain Protestant truths, it still clung to the papal hierarchy of the Roman Church, and it persecuted dissidents with ardent zeal. The Puritan separatists believed each congregation was a self-sufficient Church of Christ, Nicholson says. He means a local church. They met in private homes all over London. The congregants would meet around a large table, usually holding 40 to 50 people. The minister was at the head. He would take the communion bread and the wine. These are Nicholson's words, the fruit of the vine, the communion bread. And after blessing them, pass them down to each member. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound how most churches of Christ partake the Lord's Supper? Not that the minister is the head of the table. I'm just saying that there's no official sanctioning by some kind of denominational head. Each church is its own body of believers that have congregated to work together in that particular local place. And they gather together on the first day of the week to partake the Lord's Supper like these people were doing. But that was scandalous to the Roman and English church officials because they saw the elements of the supper as being sacraments that had to be officially dispensed to the laity only by the priest and others of the official church. And so you can imagine what that brought people into. So throughout the second half of the 1580s, Richard Bancroft, as Archbishop of Canterbury, saw it as his mission to persecute these people out of existence. A tiny minority, no more than a couple of hundred in England, fled to the Netherlands, and then, of course, the Pilgrims would make their way and to the New World and begin what would be, even to now, a great boon to mankind. And that is that no official religion should ever be promulgated by the powers that be. And that is, written sacrosanct into American culture. And it had to do with the peoples that fled here initially, the Pilgrims in 1620, and thereafter the colonies that would believe in religious freedom and the right of each man to understand the Bible. Others were arrested. To go back to this time, some 52 were jailed in hideous London dungeons without beds, not even straw to sleep on the stone floor, just on the stone floor. Many of them long periods of time. Roger Waters, who was 18 years old, was kept in irons for more than a year. Henry Barrow was a leading separatist, was held in Fleet Prison, one of the better ones fit for gentlemen, it was said. He was arrested in 1587, so before this time, but still he was interrogated by Lancelot Andrewes, who was one of the translators of the King James, and William Hutchinson in March of 1590s. And here is a recording of that. Hutchinson: to confer brotherly with you concerning certain positions that you are said to hold. Barrow: to obtain such conference where the book of God might peaceably decide all our controversies. So see what he's saying? Let the Bible determine what the truth is. Andrewes releases a flood of hostile questions at that point. It was salt in the eyes of the church officials. All the issues of order and authority, as Nicholson says, the great political questions of the day streamed out over their prisoner conversant at this point. Why the book of God cannot speak, Andrews said. Which way should that decide our controversy? Barrow said, I willingly submit my whole faith to be tried and judged by the word of God. And Andrews' answer is, all men cannot judge. Who then shall judge the word? In other words, the official stand of the Church of England is, Andrews speaking for that, is only the Church of England determines what the word of God says, not every man. And yet Barrow would not accept that, nor would countless others. Barrow would say, the word, and let every one that judges take heed that he judge aright thereby by that word. All men cannot judge, Andrews said. No, the word, and every man judges by it, Barrow would go on to say. He pled with them for friends to visit him, to be let out in the open air, to have books to read. But Andrews denied him all of those things. And 3 years later, his life ended in execution on April 6, 1593, for denying the authority of the Church of England bishops, denying the holiness of the English church and its liturgy, and denying the authority over it of the Queen at that time. And he suffered ultimately to be a martyr. Folks, we have lived in strange times to not suffer persecution because of the truth that we believe. And we need to understand, would we accept a fate like Barrow's for holding the truth? Would we be cast into a prison to sleep on a stone floor, to never go out into open air, to never be allowed to read books again, to never have friends visit us, to languish there day after day, week into week, month into month, year into year, and then ultimately be brought out and executed? Would we give in is the great question for all of us. And so God warns us. Read this by Adam Nicholson. I think I read it to you, at least in thought, a minute ago. That was the central question of the Reformation. Did Christians not need a church to interpret God for them, or could they have access to the Godhead without help? Barrow replied in the spirit of Luther. Each soul could converse with God direct, unmediated by any worldly church, his thoughts and actions to be interpreted by the words of Scripture itself. And we hold that as sacrosanct in our time, that each man has the right to take a copy of the Scriptures and understand it for himself. Now to the point I wanted to make out of the Bible. Luke 21, verse 12, and then verses 16 through 19. Jesus warns us, but before all these things, he says to his disciples, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives, and friends, and they will put some of you to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But not a hair of your head shall be lost. By your patience, possess your souls. It's hard to read those words without emotion, without realizing that we have paid very little to suffer for our faith. And so maybe we be true to what God says and realize how many have been willing to pay the ultimate sacrifice in order that we might read the Hebrew and Greek of the Old and New Testaments in the English tongue. Thank you very much for listening.